A secret love affair turned murderous, and now a restless spirit haunts the waters of one of America's most beautiful locations. Welcome back to Avery After Dark. I'm your host, Avery Ross. I'm so happy you tuned in for today's very spooky episode. If you're new here, welcome. If you're a fan of mystery and those stories that give you chills, this is the channel for you. Thanks so much for subscribing, leave a like and a comment while you're here, and turn on post notifications. I upload new videos every week and I don't want you to ever miss out. Now, without further ado, let's get into today's haunting, shall we? The Adirondack Mountains in northeastern New York have been a favorite vacation spot for many for years. And the old Covewood Lodge is one of the most legendary spots that sits on the shores of Big Moose Lake. Covewood is nestled among balsam firs, spruce, and cedar trees, and the area is known for its beauty, and also its resident ghost. The spirit of Grace Brown, a beautiful woman whose brutal murder in the area decades ago shocked the nation. To understand this haunting, we have to go way back. Grace Brown was a 19-year-old woman who worked at a skirt factory in Cortland, New York. There, in 1905, Grace met a man by the name of Chester Gillette, the charming nephew of the factory owner. And at the time, Chester was thought to be quite the catch. He was very popular. And he set his sights on Grace, who quickly fell in love with him. For her, it meant so much. She was young, but she felt like she was in love. But for Chester, this was a very secret affair. He never took Grace out in public. He never even acknowledged the two were dating. They would only meet in private. In the meantime, Chester had a reputation of dating lots of other women, often from wealthier families, socialites in town. But Grace continued to see him, hoping things would eventually change. And eventually, Grace became pregnant. And at that time in history, unwed mothers were frowned upon. If you were pregnant as a single woman, it was considered publicly shameful. Many women were made to feel completely alone. And Grace begged Chester to marry her, thinking this would be the best way to handle the situation. If the two got married, they could avoid any public ridicule. And plus, Grace loved him, so this was the solution in her eyes. But Chester had different plans. One day in July 1906, Chester took Grace to the Adirondacks, out on a boat on Big Moose Lake. Grace assumed this would be their engagement trip, as apparently he had gone along with it and spoke of the two indeed getting married. That afternoon, Chester and Grace arrived at the docks. Grace excitedly climbed on board, and a man by the name of Robert Morrison rented out a rowboat to Grace and Chester, thinking they were just a sweet couple out for a romantic date. Robert hung around the docks and assumed the two would be back by dinner time, but they never came back. Robert was growing concerned, fearing the couple maybe got lost, were stranded out there, or had some kind of terrible accident. So the next morning, he organized a search party, and a group of men went out searching Big Moose Lake for the couple. And only a short time into their journey, the men made a gruesome discovery. They found the couple's rowboat was capsized, and not far from it, Grace's body floating deep in the lake. Seeing that Grace had drowned, they believed they would find Chester in the water as well. But he wasn't. They searched and searched, and it turns out they were looking in the wrong place. Chester was alive and quite well. 2 days later, he was found at a nearby hotel. And at first, when questioned, Chester denied even knowing who Grace was. Robert told police that Chester had in fact taken Grace out that day, and they confronted him with this. So then, Chester changed his story and said, well, yes, he did know Grace, and yes, they did go out on the boat that day. But actually, Grace jumped into the lake on her own accord because he had told her that he didn't love her anymore, and she was just so distraught. No one believed this for a second, and their suspicions were backed up by Grace herself. From Chester's rented room, authorities confiscated Grace's love letters to him as evidence. Chester was tried with Grace's murder, and the case quickly grew attention nationwide. And those love letters were read out loud in the court during the trial in the fall of 1906. And in these letters, Grace begged for Chester to accept responsibility for the pregnancy. In her final letter, written July 5th, Grace hauntingly spoke of their future plans, specifically looking forward to her impending trip with Chester to Big Moose Lake, not knowing of his plans to murder her on the trip. Grace's autopsy revealed she had suffered major head trauma, and investigators believe that during that boat ride, Chester took Grace out far enough there would be no witnesses. Then, they believed he hit Grace over the head with either an oar or a tennis racket that she had packed in her bag, after which she is believed to have fallen out of the boat and drowned. Ultimately, Chester Gillette was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and died in the electric chair on March 30th, 1908. As I mentioned, this case became big news across America, and Hollywood later transformed the story into a hit film called A Place in the Sun. Shelley Winters played Grace's character, a poor woman who worked in a factory who was seduced and then murdered by her lover. Strangely though, in the movie, the character based on Grace is portrayed as this broken down woman, sort of annoying, nagging for marriage, which by all accounts isn't accurate at all. Grace was said to be a very pleasant and beautiful woman. So that was sad, but hey, it's Hollywood. What can you expect? Eye roll. In the end, although justice was served in this case, for some reason, around the lodge, countless people say they have seen the restless spirit of a young woman wandering near Big Moose Lake. And many believe it's the ghost of Grace. On Unsolved Mysteries, they interviewed some witnesses to the paranormal activity. One summer night in 1988, it was dark out and several Covewood employees were walking towards the lodge, one of them being Rhonda Busalat. She said she needed to stop inside one of the lodges, so she made her way inside, as three of her co-workers waited out front. And as soon as Rhonda entered the lodge alone, she said she was suddenly overcome with a sense that someone was inside with her, although she knew the place was empty. It was late, no one else was around. As Rhonda was inside, trying to figure out why she felt this way, outside, her three co-workers stood stunned and speechless as they watched an apparition of a young woman appear on the balcony of the lodge. The spirit hovered for a few seconds and then disappeared, clearly wanting to be seen. Rhonda came back out and they told her about what they had seen. And Rhonda was too stunned, as she had told them that inside the lodge, she had felt a presence. A ghostly presence. After that, they were all convinced that they had seen the ghost of Grace. A few months after that, another woman named Linda Lee and her friend Bridget chose to take a trip to Big Moose Lake for a fun weekend getaway. But they said from the start the women felt on edge there. They went there to kick back and relax, but something just felt off. One night, they took a stroll around Big Moose Lake, as many visitors do, and as they walked around the water's edge, they looked up, and over the lake, they saw that same apparition of a ghostly woman hovering over the water. The women stood in shock as they watched the figure, again apparently wanting to be seen and noticed, linger for a few moments, and then disappear, just as it had done with the lodge employees before. Amazingly enough, sightings of Grace's spirit have continued throughout the years. Many people believe that ghosts can use water as a conduit to interact with the living world. From lakes and oceans to rivers and streams, there have been countless cases of ghosts communicating with people near water. Theories suggest that by using the energy found within water, ghosts are able to create an environment where they can interact with the living world. With people, they can manifest. This is often why paranormal TV shows and movies depict water as being the source of ghostly activity. And even more interesting, many cultures have long believed that drowning victims become ghostly guardians who protect surrounding waters from evil forces. Ghostly guardians? That's incredible. But what do you think? Is this the ghost of Grace? A woman who was taken from this world too soon and is still attached to the lake because of unfinished business? Or, like many believe, has she remained tied to the lake to protect surrounding waters from evil wrongdoers, like Chester Gillette? I find this haunting especially interesting because in Grace's case, her murderer was caught. He was tried and sentenced to death. So in theory, she did receive justice. In many cases like this, if a spirit is lingering around, it's thought that they need closure. They have unfinished business. But in Grace's case, she technically got it, but she still haunts the waters. But maybe it's deeper than that. No pun intended. Maybe Grace does act as a ghostly guardian, And if that's true, that's amazing. But I gotta know, what are your thoughts on this case? Leave them in the comments. I always love hearing your take. Thanks so much for subscribing to this channel for more hauntings, mysteries, and cases. Next episode, you already know I got so much more coming your way. Until then, I'm Avery Ross, and this is Avery After Dark.